I'm here alongside lead economist Anthony Smith. Anthony, good morning.
Good morning. So, Andrew, we have a week in review, and there's no other person I'd rather do this week in review than the one and only Andrew Cox on a perfect send-off. So, what we have here, of course, is the unemployment rate, which dropped down. I think it was 4.6% in the most recent report out. And so, good news because we're seeing a lot of the segments that have been really kind of pointing to consumer conditions improving. And so, this is one of those areas that we're seeing some improvement. The other thing that we also have to keep in mind is that participation rate still stayed steady at 61.6% or points right now. So still pretty much below where it was pre-pandemic. So even if we are seeing that employment rate improving, we also have to look at some of the underlying things like that participation rate, which is still below pandemic levels. And so that's one of the kind of catches that we have to go on there. Overall, we're looking at roughly 80%, I believe, of the employment force is back in action from the pre-pandemic levels. And so that's a good sign there as well.
Remind me of what goes into the participation rate, because I'm thinking, were there many early retirements or kind of like forced early retirements? We saw that a lot in the trucking industry heading at when the pandemic hit. They tried to offload cost off the balance sheet. Does that play an impact here on the participation rate? Maybe some of these early retirees are not going to come back, and it might take longer than we think to get that participation rate back up.
That's definitely a big thing there. I mean, if you look at a lot of industries, and I think we usually sometimes see this during times of recession. If you can get out now, why not? Why not? Why put yourself through another or this unstable time? So I can only imagine when we're looking at industries like, of course, pilots, air traffic controllers. When you look at those segments of the economy, there's not going to be a lot. That's going to be a slower industry to come back, and there might not be as much incentive to kind of get back into the game. So I can definitely see that for sure playing into a lot of some of the segments. And of course, adjacent industries, as you mentioned, trucking. If maybe you aren't happy with being a driver and there's an adjacent industry like construction and you're good with your hands and you can do things like that, maybe now you want to be home a little bit more often, a little better work-life balance, you're not on the road for so long. So definitely a huge factor there as well.
Gotcha. All right, what else you got for us?
So in the next chart here, we have to talk about it. I love it. That non-defense capital goods new orders, excluding aircraft. And if you want to get fancy, look at it on a year-over-year basis as well. In the blue line and in the green line, have my favorite chart, of course, the flatbed outbound tender rejection index. So we had the early release yesterday, last week. And then we had the final full report earlier on this week. And so what we saw was a 0.2% gain in overall durable goods new orders. The full report also breaks down the segments of process, where they are in the process. So are the materials, and still being worked on, or are we still seeing that goods are unfinished? Are goods being shipped? Are goods, so where they are in the process. And what we're seeing right now is that there are a lot of goods still in process for machinery and still in process for furniture. Those both were at double digits year-over-year growth, showing that there is a lot of stuff that's being held up that's not really finished, that's still in the works right now. So looking at that, that's really one of the big telling signs of if we start to see a downward movement in new orders, which I think we're going to see a peak in rate of growth for new orders soon. There's still a significant amount of momentum left in the tank when we're looking at how we're going to move these raw materials throughout the country. There's a lot of, I think you had a great example when you talked about that Tesla example with that one small piece that's missing. There's going to be a lot of those situations, especially with used trucks, or new trucks, I should say. A lot of them are produced and manufactured. It's just that one thing that's missing to really complete the process.
So we spoke about this on Great Quarter, guys, the PMI that came out, the Purchasing Managers Index that came out for the month of October. We saw the new orders kind of took a step down. I think they're down 5 or 6%. And that wasn't so worrisome to you because the backlog was still strong. But what have your thoughts changed on that since then? If we see another month of new orders down, will that start to just give you some worries that maybe our momentum here is sliding?
Well, Andrew, glad you mentioned that. So in our next chart we have here, I think our ISM PMI, specifically the manufacturing new orders. So just as you mentioned, we saw a downtick down to 59.8, and so that is worrisome. A little bit, not too concerning just yet because it's 1 month, but it is a significant drop. If we look at historical movements, we have seen significant drops, but again, we see them pop back up pretty quickly. So if we see this move down for a second month, that's when I'm going to start to be a little bit more, all right, there's a telling sign here. Just because we've seen this one, I'm not calling it just yet, But I do think that this is a sign, along with the non-defense capital goods new orders excluding aircraft on a year-over-year basis, slowing down and easing in a sense. I think we are starting to see potentially that momentum starting to ease in a bit. So if I see a second month of this, I'm going to call this one a trend earlier than I would. Usually I'll wait 3 months before I say, hey, there's something going on here, there's a shift. If I see 2 downward movements of significant decline here, I might call this a trend, like, all right, things are starting to shift here.
Is it frustrating to you as an economist quickly to see there is so much demand and it's just not being fulfilled because of labor and supply issues?
Yeah, the most frustrating thing, this was how I was feeling specifically with housing and construction throughout much of 2019. There was this extraordinary demand, and I think that's why we saw so much of a rebound and such a huge growth of demand throughout COVID.
Right.
But that was one of the areas where it's just so frustrating to see the inefficiencies of a lack of available lots. Materials wasn't quite much of an issue back then in 2019, but now it is becoming a bigger issue now. But definitely a huge frustration to see so much demand and so much inefficiencies, and the frustration is just building around. I can only imagine people in the trenches doing it real time.
Doing it on a daily basis.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Anthony.